The glow of the massive television screen bathed the modern penthouse living room in cold blue light. Lily Moreau, the CEO of Zenith Enterprises, leaned back in her leather armchair, absently swirling the untouched wine in her glass. She had been battling the same hollow ache for 5 years, burying herself in work to silence the relentless whispers of loss. Success was her armor, wealth her shield, and power her weapon against a world that had once robbed her of happiness. The news anchor's polished voice broke through her thoughts, and in an unprecedented turn of events, the elusive billionaire Alexander Knight, founder of Novatech Solutions, has overtaken global wealth rankings. Knight, who keeps an extraordinarily low profile, is set to make a public appearance at this evening's gala in London, his first in years. Her hand froze mid-sip, the glass trembling slightly. The face on the screen was unmistakable, even behind the mask of time and refined elegance. The strong jawline, the piercing green eyes, the unruly dark hair that once fell into his eyes when he laughed. This was no ordinary billionaire. It was Michael, her Michael, the man who had disappeared 5 years ago on the very morning they were supposed to sign their marriage certificate. Lily's heart pounded against her ribcage. The room seemed to close in, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. Her mind screamed for rationality, for reason. It couldn't be him, but it was. She clenched the armrests, forcing herself to focus. The man she had mourned, the man she had searched for until hope crumbled to dust, was alive. And not just alive, he was thriving as one of the wealthiest men in the world. Her trembling fingers reached for the remote. Rewinding the footage, she paused on his face. There it was again, that same faint scar above his left eyebrow from a skateboarding accident in college. She remembered how he laughed it off, calling it his badge of clumsiness. "Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A flood of questions drowned her thoughts. Where had he been? Why hadn't he reached out? And why, of all things, was he living under an entirely new identity? Lily sprang to her feet, the glass of wine abandoned on the sleek marble table. She paced the length of the room, trying to piece together a puzzle with missing fragments. The weight of betrayal, mixed with a desperate, irrational hope. Was he in danger back then? Did he choose to leave? Or was it something darker? Something she couldn't yet fathom? The door to the penthouse opened, and her assistant, Grace, stepped in hesitantly. "Ms. Moreau, the Hong Kong team needs confirmation on the merger," Grace began, but stopped short at the sight of Lily's expression. "Are you all right?" Lily turned to her assistant, her usual commanding demeanor shaken. "I need a flight to London. Tonight." Grace blinked. "But the board meeting—" "Cancel it." Lily's tone was sharp. "This is personal." Grace hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Understood. I'll arrange everything." As the private jet soared through the night sky, Lily stared out at the inky expanse of clouds below. Her mind replayed memories like fragments of an old movie reel. She remembered the way Michael used to hold her hand when they walked by the Seine, the way he whispered promises of forever. The day he disappeared was etched in her soul. They had planned a simple visit to City Hall, laughing about how their wedding would be little more than paperwork and a lunch date. Then he vanished. No calls, no texts, just an empty apartment and a note that read, "I'm sorry, I'll come back for you." But he never did. The bitter taste of that memory made her jaw clench. She thought she had moved on, though the wounds never truly healed. And now, seeing him alive and successful, felt like an insult to every tear she had shed. She needed answers, and she would get them, even if it meant tearing down the walls he had built around his new life. The gala was a spectacle of wealth and opulence. London's elite gathered in the grand ballroom of the Marlowe Hotel, draped in shimmering gowns and tailored suits. Lily entered the room with purpose, her black dress sleek and understated, her presence commanding as ever. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for him. The buzz of conversation and clinking of champagne flutes faded into the background. Then she saw him. He stood near the stage, flanked by a crowd of admirers. The air around him seemed charged, his every movement exuding charisma and power. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his posture confident yet restrained. His eyes swept the room casually, as though he owned it. And when their gazes met, time seemed to stop. Michael, or Alexander as the world now knew him, froze. His mask of calm faltered for the briefest moment, but it was enough. Lily saw recognition flash in his eyes, followed by something else. Guilt. She moved toward him, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. The crowd seemed to part instinctively, their conversations dropping to hushed murmurs as they sensed the tension. "Michael," she said, her voice steady but tinged with an edge of steel. He hesitated, then forced a smile. "I go by Alexander now." Her heart twisted at his calm dismissal. "Is that so?" she replied, her tone sharper than intended. "It's been a long time." "Indeed it has," he said, his voice awfully measured. "I didn't expect to see you here." "And I didn't expect to see you alive," she shot back, her eyes narrowing. "Care to explain?" Before he could respond, the host took the stage, announcing the beginning of the event. Applause erupted, momentarily breaking the charged silence between them. Michael, no, Alexander, used the distraction to step closer. "Not here," he said quietly. "Meet me on the terrace in 10 minutes. Lily's lips tightened, but she gave a curt nod. Whatever explanation he had, she would hear it. And it had better be good. The terrace was a quiet escape from the noise of the gala. The cool London night wrapped around Lily as she waited, her arms crossed. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. "Lily," he began, his voice soft but firm. "Don't," she interrupted, her emotions bubbling to the surface. "Don't say my name like nothing happened, like you didn't disappear without a trace, like you didn't destroy me." He exhaled slowly, his gaze heavy with unspoken words. "I didn't have a choice." Her laugh was bitter. "There's always a choice, Michael, or Alexander, or whoever you've decided to be. I had to protect you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I can't explain everything here, but please believe me, I never stopped thinking about you." She took a step closer, her eyes blazing. 5 years, Michael. 5. Do you have any idea what that did to me? To wake up every day wondering if you were dead, or just gone." His jaw tightened, and for the first time she saw a crack in his composure. "I'll explain everything, but not tonight. Give me a chance to fix this." Lily stared at him, torn between anger and the painful flicker of hope she thought she had buried. "You owe me the truth, all of it." "You'll have it," he promised. "Tomorrow. I'll meet you at St. James's Park at noon." She hesitated, then nodded. "If you don't show up this time, don't bother looking for me again." "I'll be there," he said softly. As he turned to leave, Lily stood frozen, her heart pounding. The man she loved and hated was back. But she wasn't sure if she could trust him again. Lily's morning began in a haze of restless dreams and unanswered questions. The sight of Michael, no, Alexander, had ignited emotions she had buried beneath years of ambition and grief. But anger and hope coiled tightly in her chest, vying for dominance. Could she believe anything he had to say after his betrayal? By the time the sleek black car pulled up outside St. James's Park, Lily's resolve had crystallized. She stepped out, her tailored coat billowing slightly in the breeze. The iconic London park was alive with morning joggers, tourists and locals enjoying the crisp air. She scanned the crowd, her sharp gaze searching for a familiar face. She didn't have to look long. Alexander was already there, leaning casually against a lamppost, his expression unreadable. He was dressed down in a dark sweater and coat, a stark contrast to the commanding presence he exuded the night before. Lily approached with measured steps, the click of her heels softened by the gravel path. When she stopped a few feet away, her voice carried the weight of 5 years of unanswered questions. "You showed up. That's a start." He straightened, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken words. "I always intended to come back," he said finally, "but things didn't go as planned." Her laugh was sharp, cutting through the morning air. "Planned? Is that what you call vanishing on the day we were supposed to start our lives together?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "Lily, I know how it must have looked." "No, you don't," she interrupted, her voice rising. "You don't know what it's like to wake up and find the person you trusted most gone without a word. To spend years wondering if you were dead or just—" Her voice broke. "Gone." Alexander flinched at the raw pain in her words. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "You deserved better. I didn't want to hurt you." "Then why?" she demanded. "Why leave? Why stay gone for so long? And why the hell are you living as someone else?" He hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "The day I left, I thought I was protecting you. There were people, dangerous people, who would have hurt you to get to me." She frowned, crossing her arms. "What people? Why would anyone target you?" "I can't give you all the details yet," he said, his tone cautious. "But back then I uncovered something big. It put me in their crosshairs. I had to disappear to keep you safe." Her eyes narrowed. "You're telling me this is about some conspiracy? That you're some kind of martyr?" "I'm telling you," he said firmly, "that I would have done anything to keep you out of harm's way, even if it meant breaking your heart." The words hit her like a blow, stirring both anger and a flicker of something she wasn't ready to name. She shook her head. "And now, what's changed?" He glanced around as if ensuring they weren't being overheard. "Things settled for a while. I rebuilt my life under a new name, a new identity. But the people who wanted me gone, they're back, and they're stronger than ever." Lily felt the weight of his words, but she refused to let him off the hook so easily. "And you still didn't think to warn me? To tell me you were alive?" "I couldn't risk leading them to you," he said, his voice low. "I thought staying away was the only way to keep you safe. But when I saw you last night—" He trailed off, his expression softening. "I couldn't stay away anymore." Her heart betrayed her, skipping a beat at the sincerity in his voice. But she couldn't forget the years of pain, the sleepless nights spent wondering if she'd ever get closure. Lily took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. "You can't just walk back into my life with half-truths and expect me to forgive you. I need answers, Michael. Real answers." His lips quirked in a faint, sad smile. "I don't blame you. You deserve the truth." "Then start talking." As they walked through the park, Alexander began to unravel the story. He spoke of his work as a software engineer, a seemingly ordinary career until he stumbled upon sensitive data that shouldn't have existed. Files detailing illegal dealings, corruption at the highest levels, and connections to powerful figures. When he reported it to his superiors, thinking he'd done the right thing, the backlash was swift and brutal. "They framed me for embezzlement," he said, his tone bitter. "Froze my accounts, destroyed my reputation. Then they came after me directly." Lily listened, her emotions a storm of disbelief and anger. "And instead of fighting back, you ran?" "I didn't have a choice," he said quietly. "These weren't people you could expose with a whistleblower report. They had resources, connections. I barely escaped that first night. Why not come to me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "We could have faced it together." His eyes met hers, filled with regret. "I couldn't drag you into that kind of danger. You meant too much to me." The words hung between them, heavy with emotion. For a moment Lily didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to believe him, to believe that his disappearance was an act of love rather than abandonment. But another part of her, wounded and wary, wasn't ready to forgive so easily. "And now?" she asked finally. "Why come back now?" "Because they're coming for me again," he said, his tone grim. "But this time, I'm ready. I have resources, allies. I can fight back. But I need your help." Lily froze, her mind racing. "My help?" "You have connections," he said. "Influence. I need someone I can trust." She let out a short laugh. "Trust? You're asking me to trust you after everything?" "I know I have no right to ask," he admitted. "But I don't have anyone else." For a long moment, Lily studied him, searching his face for any sign of deception. What she saw was a man worn down by years of survival, but still carrying a spark of the Michael she once knew. She hated that part of her still cared. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But don't mistake this for forgiveness." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Fair enough." Their conversation ended, but the weight of it lingered as Lily returned to her penthouse later that day. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. Michael, or Alexander, had opened the door to a world she barely understood, and stepping through it felt as terrifying as it did inevitable. As she stared out at the city skyline, a single thought consumed her. Could she trust him again? And if she couldn't, what would it cost her to find out the truth? The days following her meeting with Alexander were a blur of restless nights and unanswered questions. Lily couldn't shake the gnawing doubt that his sudden reappearance had more layers than he was revealing. Yet she couldn't deny the flicker of hope. Hope for closure, hope for answers, and maybe, just maybe, hope for the man she once loved. When her phone buzzed with an unknown number late in the evening, she answered without hesitation. "Lily Moreau." "It's me." Alexander's voice came through, low and steady. "I need to see you. Tonight." Her pulse quickened, but she kept her tone neutral. "Why?" "There's something I need to show you, something that will explain everything." Lily hesitated. Trusting him felt like stepping onto a thin sheet of ice, but curiosity gnawed at her. Where? I'll send the address. Be discreet. The line went dead before she could reply. Minutes later, her phone chimed with a location, a warehouse on the outskirts of London. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her coat and keys, leaving her penthouse behind. The warehouse was a stark contrast to the opulence of her usual surroundings. Its corrugated metal walls loomed in the dim light, and the faint hum of activity inside hinted at secrets hidden in the shadows. As she approached, the heavy door creaked open, revealing Alexander waiting just inside. His expression was unreadable as he gestured for her to follow. This way. Where are we? She asked, her voice steady despite the unease coiling in her stomach. You'll see. He led her down a narrow hallway that opened into a cavernous room filled with monitors, computers, and a team of people who barely glanced at her as they worked. Maps, charts, and photographs were pinned to the walls, creating a mosaic of interconnected mysteries. Welcome to the heart of the operation, Alexander said, his tone tinged with irony. Lily's gaze swept over the room. And what exactly is the operation? He walked to a monitor and tapped a few keys, pulling up a dossier. The screen filled with profiles of powerful figures, politicians, executives, and names she recognized from headlines. These are the people who tried to kill me, he said, the ones who've been pulling strings behind the scenes for years. Her brow furrowed as she scanned the images. And you expect me to believe this? That you've been playing some covert game against, what, the shadow government? Alexander leaned closer, his eyes piercing. You don't have to believe me. Just look at the evidence. He handed her a tablet loaded with files, emails, financial records, and video footage. As she scrolled through, the magnitude of what she was seeing began to sink in. Illegal arms deals, blackmail schemes, offshore accounts tied to high-profile names. It was damning. Why show me this? She asked, her voice quieter now. Because you're the only person I trust, he said. And because they'll come after you too, once they realize we've reconnected. Lily's heart skipped a beat. You're putting me in danger by even being here. They already know about you, he said grimly. You've been under surveillance since the day I disappeared. Her blood ran cold. What are you talking about? Alexander pointed to a monitor displaying footage of her penthouse, captured from an angle she didn't recognize. This is live, he said. They've had eyes on you for years. Lily stared at the screen, her mind racing. The thought of being watched, of her life being invaded without her knowledge, made her stomach churn. She turned to Alexander, her voice trembling with fury. You should have told me. I didn't want to scare you, he said. But now that I'm back, they'll escalate. We have to act fast. Her instincts screamed at her to walk away, to cut ties with this man who had brought chaos into her life. But the evidence was too compelling to ignore, and beneath her anger lay a stubborn streak of loyalty she couldn't shake. What's your plan? She asked, her tone clipped. Alexander's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if her question signaled an unspoken agreement. We take them down, expose their network, disrupt their operations, and make it impossible for them to rebuild. And you think that's possible? He met her gaze, his eyes blazing with determination. It has to be. The next few days were a whirlwind. Alexander's team worked tirelessly, uncovering more layers of the conspiracy, while Lily provided access to her own network of contacts and resources. She found herself drawn deeper into the web of intrigue, her initial skepticism giving way to a grudging belief in Alexander's mission. But trust was a fragile thing, and doubt lingered in the corners of her mind. One evening, as they pored over documents in the dimly lit warehouse, she finally voiced her fears. What if this is all just another lie? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What if you're using me, like you did before? Alexander looked up from his laptop, his expression earnest. Lily, I know I've hurt you, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if I have to. But this, he gestured to the files around them, this is real, and I need you to believe in it. She held his gaze, searching for any sign of deception. What she saw was vulnerability, raw and unguarded. It wasn't an answer, but it was enough to keep her going, for now. As the operation gained momentum, so did the danger. Lily's every move was shadowed by the weight of unseen threats. One night, as she returned to her penthouse, she found her door slightly ajar. Her heart leapt into her throat as she pushed it open, her senses on high alert. The living room was untouched, but a single item on the coffee table sent a chill down her spine. A photograph of her and Alexander, taken at a cafe years ago. Scrawled across the image in red ink were the words, "Stay out of this." Her hands shook as she picked up the photo, the implication clear. They knew she was involved, and they weren't afraid to send a message. She called Alexander immediately, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "We have a problem." When he arrived minutes later, his expression darkened as he examined the photograph. "They're trying to scare you. It's working," she admitted, "but it's not going to stop me." His gaze softened, and he stepped closer, his voice low. "Lily, you don't have to do this. You've already risked enough." "And let them win," she said, her eyes blazing. "No. If I'm in this, I'm in all the way." Alexander's lips quirked in a faint smile, a flicker of admiration breaking through his tension. "You've always been braver than you give yourself credit for." As the days turned into weeks, the stakes grew higher. The team uncovered a critical lead, an encrypted drive containing the names of key players in the conspiracy, but obtaining it required more than digital finesse. It required infiltration. "I'll go," Alexander said as they discussed the plan. "No," Lily interjected, her voice firm. "You're too recognizable now. If they catch you, it's over." "And you think they won't catch you?" he countered. "They won't be looking for me," she said. "I'm the better choice." Alexander stared at her, his jaw tightening. "It's too dangerous." "So is sitting here and doing nothing," she shot back. "You need that drive and I can get it." The tension between them crackled like a live wire, but Alexander finally relented. "Fine, but we do this my way. No risks, no improvisation." Lily nodded, though she knew nothing about this mission would be safe. As she prepared for the operation, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was building toward a moment of no return. When the night of the mission arrived, she slipped into the target building with practiced ease, her nerves steeled by sheer determination. The drive was exactly where their intel said it would be, but as she reached for it, the sound of footsteps froze her in place. Her heart pounded as she ducked behind a column, clutching the drive. A figure loomed in the doorway, and for a moment she thought she was caught. But then the figure moved on and she exhaled shakily, making her escape. When she returned to the warehouse, drive in hand, Alexander met her at the door. Relief and pride flashed across his face as she handed it over. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "I told you I could," she replied, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. But as they examined the contents of the drive, the scope of what they were up against became painfully clear. The names, the connections, the sheer power of the people involved, it was overwhelming. "We're in deep now," Alexander said, his voice grim. "There's no turning back." Lily met his gaze, her resolve unshaken. "Then we keep going, no matter what it takes." The encrypted drive was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. As Lily sat beside Alexander in the dimly lit warehouse, the weight of what they'd uncovered pressed down on her. Names of politicians, tech moguls, and shadowy operatives filled the screen. The depth of corruption was staggering, and the implications were chilling. Alexander's team worked tirelessly, decoding files and preparing the information for release. But with every passing hour, the danger loomed larger. Their adversaries wouldn't sit idly by while their empire crumbled. "We're close," Alexander murmured, his eyes scanning the screen. "Once we release this, they'll have nowhere to hide." "And us?" Lily asked, her voice steady. "What happens when they come for us?" He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "I won't let that happen." The words were meant to comfort, but Lily saw the strain in his expression. Alexander was a man carrying the weight of his choices, and she knew the fight ahead would test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The plan was straightforward: release the files to multiple media outlets simultaneously, ensuring the truth reached the public before their enemies could intervene. But as the clock ticked closer to their planned launch, the warehouse's surveillance system detected movement outside. "Someone's here," one of Alexander's team members said, his voice tight. Alexander moved swiftly, checking the monitors. A fleet of black SUVs had surrounded the building, their windows tinted and their engines idling ominously. "They've found us," he said, his jaw tightening. Lily's heart pounded, but she forced herself to focus. "What do we do?" "We stick to the plan," Alexander replied. He turned to his team. "Secure the data and prep for remote access. We can't let them get to the files." The room erupted into controlled chaos as everyone moved with practiced precision. Alexander grabbed Lily's arm, pulling her aside. "You need to get out of here," he said urgently. "I'm not leaving," she shot back. "Lily, this isn't a debate. If they catch you, then they'll have to catch us both," she interrupted, her voice firm. "I'm not running." Alexander stared at her, frustration and admiration warring in his expression. "You're impossible. And you love me for it," she said, a faint smile breaking through the tension. Before he could respond, a deafening crash shook the building. The SUVs had rammed through the warehouse's outer gates, and the sound of boots on gravel signaled the arrival of heavily armed operatives. Alexander's team moved to defensive positions, their calm efficiency a testament to years of preparation. But Lily knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. Their only chance was to buy time for the files to be uploaded. "Stay close to me," Alexander said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As the first wave of attackers breached the warehouse, chaos erupted. Gunfire shattered the air and Lily ducked behind a steel pillar, her heart racing. Alexander moved with precision, his focus unwavering as he coordinated their defense. Minutes felt like hours as the battle raged. The operatives were relentless, their goal clear: silence the whistleblowers and destroy the evidence. But Alexander's team held their ground, using every resource at their disposal. Lily found herself thrust into the thick of it, her adrenaline surging as she fought to protect the files. She wasn't a soldier, but desperation and determination gave her strength. When one of the operatives closed in, she swung a metal pipe with all her might, knocking him to the ground. "Nice swing," Alexander called out, a hint of pride in his voice. "Don't get used to it," she replied, breathless but resolute. Despite their best efforts, the attackers began to overwhelm them. The warehouse's defenses were crumbling, and the upload was only halfway complete. Alexander knew they were running out of time. "We need to trigger the failsafe," he said, his voice tight. One of his team members nodded, inputting a command into the system. A series of hidden servers activated, ensuring the files would be disseminated even if the main hub was compromised. "It's done," the team member said, "but we won't have long before they trace the signal." Alexander turned to Lily. "We have to go now." She hesitated, her gaze sweeping the room. "What about the others?" "They'll follow," he said. "But we can't risk you staying here." Reluctantly she nodded, and they made their way to a hidden exit. The sound of gunfire and shouts faded as they slipped into the night, but the weight of their escape hung heavy in the air. The safe house was a stark contrast to the chaos they'd left behind. It was small and unassuming, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. As they entered, Lily sank onto the worn couch, her exhaustion finally catching up to her. Alexander paced the room, his mind clearly racing. The files are out there now. It's only a matter of time before the world sees the truth. "And what happens to us?" Lily asked, her voice quiet. "We lay low for a while," he said. "Once the dust settles, we'll figure out our next move." She studied him, her emotions a tangled mess of relief, anger, and lingering love. "You always think one step ahead, don't you?" "It's how I've survived," he admitted. "But is it living?" she asked, her voice soft but pointed. "Constantly running, looking over your shoulder? Is that the life you want?" His steps faltered, and he turned to her, his expression unguarded. "It's not the life I want, but it's the one I chose to protect you." The weight of his words settled between them, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then, slowly, Lily rose and crossed the room, closing the distance between them. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, her voice steady. "We're in this together now." Alexander's gaze softened, and for the first time in years, she saw a flicker of the man she'd fallen in love with. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. "Probably not," she replied, a faint smile playing at her lips. "But you're stuck with me anyway." A quiet laugh escaped him, and he reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As dawn broke over the city, the first wave of headlines began to spread. News outlets around the world picked up the story, their broadcasts filled with damning revelations. The names on the list were no longer untouchable, their secrets laid bare for the world to see. But the fight was far from over. Alexander and Lily knew their enemies wouldn't go down without a fight. There would be retaliation, consequences for their defiance. But for the first time in years, they faced the future with hope. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the files rippled across the globe. Arrests were made, governments toppled, and long-hidden truths came to light. Alexander's name became synonymous with courage and resilience, though he remained in the shadows, unwilling to claim the spotlight. For Lily, the journey was one of healing as much as justice. She had found closure in the answers she sought, but more importantly, she had found a new sense of purpose, and in the process, she had rediscovered the love she thought she had lost. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their latest safe house, Lily turned to Alexander, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't disappeared?" He met her gaze, his eyes filled with quiet regret. "Every day." She reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. "We can't change the past, but we have a chance to build something new. Together." A smile tugged at his lips. Together. As they watched the sunset, the weight of their journey lifted, replaced by the promise of a future they would face side by side. The world might never be the same, but for the first time in years, they were exactly where they were meant to be, together and unbroken.